Hello, my name is Miss Malaya from the Chobham Academy English Department, and today I'll be talking you through examples of extended symbolism in Macbeth. We will be exploring three different motifs: the image of the sword and the dagger, the image of hell, and the image of blood. So we'll start with the image of the sword and the dagger, and in this instance, it's going to be a symbol of Macbeth and his state of mind. So to begin with, in Act 1, Scene 2, where we haven't quite met Macbeth yet, but we hear about him from the captain. The captain says he brandished his steel which smote with bloody execution. So here the sword represents a heroic Macbeth. He is a confident warrior as he's able to brandish his steel, which means to brandish and wave around his sword, and he's accustomed to killing. He's not new to it. The fact that the sword is able to smoke means he's killed so many people. He is an expert swordsman, and the irony here is that it's his skills that are going to bring about his downfall. He lived by the sword, and he will die by it, as we see later on in the play when he is killed by Macduff. And this particular quote foreshadows his excessive hubris. As we move to Act 1, Scene 7, Macbeth exclaims, "Should against his murder shut the door, not bear the knife myself." So here he's conflicted about whether to kill Duncan or not, and he's saying that he should actually be stopping the murderer from coming in, not having the knife in his hand himself. So here the sword represents a conflicted Macbeth. And this is ironic, as it's the sword that got him into Duncan's good books in the first place. And here we can see how the sword is two-sided, the side that protects and the side that harms, much like Macbeth's own two-sided, deceitful nature. As we work our way into Act 2, Scene 1, this is the floating dagger scene where Macbeth says and asks, "Is this a dagger I see before me?" Here the sword presents a malleable Macbeth. He's easily influenced, easily changed. And it's a contrast to before, where we see him as a confident man who's able to fight and protect his country and his king. Now he's doubting himself. This also goes further to represent his own inability to maintain his manhood, and the sword itself acts as a phallic symbol. Macbeth and the audience at this stage are unsure about the image that we saw of Macbeth at the start, and he's actually transformed from a brave and confident man into a lying, weak, emasculated man who is trying to regain his manhood after being insulted by his wife in previous scenes. And he follows this dagger to his downfall, which starts off the chain of events which were foreshadowed in Act 1. As we work into Act 2, Scene 2, he has killed the king and he comes back into the chambers with the swords, with the bloody daggers. And Lady Macbeth is furious and she says to him, infirm of purpose, "Give me the daggers." Here, the swords and the daggers represent an emasculated Macbeth. He's no longer a man. And the swords hold the masculine power, and by Lady Macbeth taking them off of him, it shows that she now holds all of that power that's often given to men. That imperative verb, give, presents him as a child being ordered by his mother, and this feeds into Macbeth's Oedipal complex, or his Oedipal presentation. So this idea of the Oedipal presentation comes from Sigmund Freud, who's a psychologist, and he theorizes that sometimes sons or boys often look for women who have similar qualities to that of their mother, and almost to find like a wife that plays a motherly role to them. And we see that in Macbeth. If you want to read more on Freud's Oedipal complex, I really suggest looking into it on YouTube. I'll link some videos in the description box below as well. As we move into Act 2, Scene 3, after Duncan has been killed, Donalbain, Duncan's son, says there's daggers in men's smiles, which is quite right here. He's really suspicious of what's gone on. And the swords and the daggers here represent a deceptive Macbeth. Things are not as they seem, and this kind of echoes the earlier quote we hear from Lady Macbeth at the start of the play, where she advises Macbeth to be the innocent flower, to present to be an innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. As we move into Act 4, Scene 1, Macbeth is now a king and he is a tyrant. He's no longer the good man we saw at the beginning, but actually now he's evil. He's aware that Macduff is plotting against him and he calls for his son and wife to be killed. He says, "Give to the edge of the sword his wife and his babes." So here the sword represents a Machiavellian, villainous Macbeth. And as you can see here, he is not the man we started with. He would never have demanded for the death of children and women. As we make our way into Act 5, Scene 8, this is currently when he is fighting with Macduff in the final battle, and he says, "Why should I play the Roman fool and die on mine own sword?" And here the sword represents a foolish Macbeth. He is overconfident. That rhetorical question highlights his confidence. And he thinks he's going to win because of the prophecies he's heard from the witches. And actually here we are very acutely aware that he is about to lose because he does not know that Macduff is born via C-section. So actually the prophecies are not applicable to him. This is actually referencing actual Roman generals. When they were aware that they were about to die, they would kill themselves and fall on their own swords. And he's saying here he's not going to do that because he doesn't think he's going to die. This is quite ironic, as he is technically and metaphorically already dead. As soon as he killed Duncan, he had already killed himself. As we work towards the latter scenes in the play, Act 5, Scene 8, after Macbeth has been slain, Macduff says, "My voice is in my sword." So here the sword represents a slain Macbeth. And the rightful sword now belongs to a righteous person once again. So we have had a restoration of peace. Here we can see the play as a whole act as a cyclical narrative. It brings us back to the start of the play where we see a righteous man with a righteous sword. However, here the man is no longer Macbeth, but it's Macduff. Goodness has been restored and Macbeth dies shortly after this discussion. So to summarize, we see the dagger as a symbol of Macbeth as it shows a heroic Macbeth, conflicted Macbeth, a malleable Macbeth, emasculated Macbeth, a deceptive Macbeth, villainous, foolish, and then a slain Macbeth. In this section, we'll be looking at heaven and hell as a symbol of morality. So, back in Act 1, Scene 5, in her first speech, Lady Macbeth calls for the earth to be enveloped in hell. This sets the themes of the play and foreshadows Macbeth's eventual downfall. If the earth is enclosed in smoke, people cannot see clearly, and people act badly when they cannot be seen, which explains why many of the treacherous discussions happen in private. They happen away from the eyes of the other Thanes. In Act 1, Scene 6, we then move on to Banquo, and he then says, "By his loving masonry that the heavens, breath smells wooingly here." So Banquo describes Macbeth's castle as having only goodness here, as a holy place, as Macbeth himself is perceived as a good man. Macbeth's castle here represents how he started as a righteous and holy man, who then became tarnished by sin. As we move into Act 2, Scene 2, this is after Macbeth has killed King Duncan and he has committed regicide. He says, "But wherefore could not I pronounce amen?" He can't say amen anymore. He has severed his connection to God as he has disrupted the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings outlines the idea that God selects a monarch, so a king or a queen, for the throne, and the monarchs act as a direct connection between God and man. Macbeth, by committing regicide, has killed the closest thing to God on earth, which is the worst thing he could do. As we move on to Scene 3 of Act 2, we then move on to directly after Duncan's death, where we meet the drunk porter, who mans the gate to Macbeth's castle. He then starts pretending that he's manning the gates of hell. He says, if a man were a porter of hell gate, he should have old turning the key. So he says, the porters of hell, they are always turning the key of the gate because loads of people enter hell. The irony here is that actually Macbeth's castle metaphorically represents hell. Macbeth's act of regicide has transformed this once heavenly place, as according to Banquo, to now this hellish place. As we move further into the porter's scene, he stops playing his Hell's Gate game, and he states the reason for this is that it's too cold to be hell anyway. It says in the quote, but this place is too cold for hell. However, although this sounds like an offhand comment, this could really allude to some deeper themes of the play. The fact that Macbeth's castle does metaphorically represent hell, it could be a specific element of hell. It could allude to a text that predates Macbeth called Dante's Inferno. Dante's Inferno depicts the different sections or circles of hell. The coldest part of hell, according to this text, is the ninth circle, and it's reserved for the worst people who commit treachery, which is a betrayal of trust, much like Macbeth. So actually, this may be alluding to the idea that Macbeth's castle is the ninth circle of hell. As we make our way into scene 4, this is right after Duncan's death, and Ross is speaking to an old man about the events of the last night, and he says, "Thou seest the heavens as troubled with man's act, threaten his bloody stage." Here, the audience are acutely aware that heaven is now responding to Macbeth's act against God. Heaven is retorting. And we see this throughout this particular scene, which is quite interesting, that the horses start to eat each other. It's dark when it should be daytime. It's almost as if nature and God is acting back against Macbeth. In the final part of this section, we're going to explore the final, one of the latter scenes where we meet Seward. He is currently fighting with Macbeth. Macbeth is fighting for his life. And then he mentions that not even the devil would want to pronounce Macbeth's name. As you can see in the quote there, it says, "The devil himself could not pronounce the title, more hateful to mine ear." This then presents Macbeth in his final form before his downfall, as the devil himself. We are now at the final section of this video, where we'll explore how blood acts as a symbol of guilt. Back at the beginning, with the captain describing Macbeth's heroism, we can see how he describes the amount of blood there is. He says, "Except they meant to bathe in reeking wounds or memorize another Golgotha." He's basically saying here that there's so much blood that it seemed like the second crucifixion of Jesus, which happened in Golgotha. Here, blood represents heroism and valor and sacrifice, much like Jesus himself sacrificing himself for his people. As we move into Act 2, Scene 1, this is the part where Macbeth sees the floating dagger. He described the blood on the tip of the dagger, and he says, "And on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood." Here, the blood represents Duncan's impending murder and the guilt that will eventually plague Macbeth until the end of the play, when he finally loses his battle to Macduff. In Act 2, Scene 2, this is right after Duncan's murder and Macbeth's hands are covered in blood. He claims that his guilt is so overwhelming that not even the god of the sea, Neptune, not even his seas can wash him clean. Blood symbolizes guilt here, as it does for the rest of the play. It's worth considering how he seems to have switched over from a Christian god to a Roman god. Perhaps he's trying to connect with another higher power, as he has severed his own connection with a Christian god by killing Duncan. In Act 3, Scene 4, at this stage, the blood is no longer just on his hands, but he's walking through it. It shows the extent to which guilt is overtaking his life. He says, "I am in blood steeped in so far that I wade no more. Returning were as tedious as to go over." As we then get to Act 5, Scene 1, this is that famous scene with Lady Macbeth furiously trying to wash the blood out of her hands. And again here, the blood represents guilt. She seems to be dealing with far less blood than Macbeth, as she says, "Out, damned spot, out, I say. Who would have thought the old man to have so much blood in him?" However, despite the fact that it's less blood, it seems to have had a greater effect on her than it did on Macbeth. This could be to undermine the masculine power she claimed to have at the start of the play, where she famously said, "Unsex me here." Perhaps in the end, she gave in to the conventional ideas of femininity after all, this idea that women can't actually handle evil, not even a little bit of it. Right, we have come to the end of this video. I want to thank you so much for watching. Please do spend time rewinding this video and going through any points that you want to explore a bit further. I will link some extra links in the description box so you can read around these ideas further. And overall, good luck with your revision. Thank you for watching and goodbye.